In 30 years of psychiatric practice, I've observed a peculiar phenomenon. Those who speak most passionately about compassion often inflict the greatest cruelty upon those they claim to champion. The liberal elite's version of compassion has become a form of systematic sadism, dressed in the language of virtue. From my consulting rooms in Britain's roughest hospitals to the cells of maximum security prisons, I've witnessed firsthand how well-intentioned policies designed to help the poor and vulnerable have instead trapped them in cycles of dependency and despair. The very people who craft these compassionate policies live lives carefully insulated from their consequences. They inhabit gated communities while advocating for policies that destroy working-class neighborhoods. They send their children to private schools while defending educational philosophies that condemn poor children to ignorance. This isn't mere hypocrisy, it's something far more sinister. It's compassion as a form of moral luxury, purchased with other people's suffering. Today, I'll reveal how elite compassion has become the enemy of genuine human flourishing, and why those who suffer most are precisely those whom this compassion claims to serve. The truth about liberal compassion isn't just uncomfortable, it's shocking in its systematic cruelty disguised as virtue. Chapter 1: The Medical Evidence of Compassionate Cruelty. During my years treating patients in Britain's inner cities, I encountered a woman named Margaret, not her real name, of course, who embodied the devastating effects of compassionate policy. At 43, she had never held a job, never lived independently, and had borne 7 children to 5 different fathers. Each pregnancy had been celebrated by social workers as an expression of her autonomy, each child immediately placed in care as evidence of her victimization by society. Margaret wasn't unusual. She was the product of a system designed, with the finest intentions, to liberate her from the constraints of traditional morality and personal responsibility. The architects of this liberation lived in leafy suburbs, their own children attending schools where such chaos would be unthinkable. What struck me most profoundly wasn't Margaret's circumstances, but her complete inability to conceive of any other way of living. The welfare state hadn't merely failed to help her, it had systematically destroyed her capacity for self-improvement. Every institution supposedly designed for her benefit had instead cultivated her dependency. The housing department provided accommodation without requiring contribution. The social services intervened to solve every crisis without demanding she learn to prevent them. The educational system had taught her that her feelings mattered more than facts, that her experiences trumped evidence, that society owed her a living regardless of her choices. This represents compassion in its most perverted form. True compassion would have demanded that Margaret develop the skills necessary for independent living. It would have recognized that human beings require challenge and responsibility to flourish. Instead, liberal compassion treated her as a pet to be fed and housed, not as a human being capable of growth and achievement. The result? 7 children condemned to repeat their mother's pattern, an entire family trapped in a system that profits from their dysfunction while claiming to serve their interests. This isn't compassion, it's systematic child abuse disguised as social justice. Chapter 2: The Cultural Laboratory of Elite Virtue. The prison where I worked served as an inadvertent laboratory for observing the cultural consequences of elite compassion. Here, young men arrived daily, products of an educational philosophy that prioritized self-esteem over achievement, expression over discipline, and feelings over facts. These weren't hardened criminals, they were confused young people raised in a culture that had systematically eliminated every traditional source of meaning and structure from their lives. Consider the case of Jason, a 19-year-old who couldn't read but possessed an unshakable belief in his own specialness. His teachers had spent years telling him that literacy was just one way of knowing, that his street knowledge was equally valid, that academic standards were tools of oppression. Meanwhile, these same teachers ensured their own children received rigorous classical educations. Jason had been encouraged to express himself through violence, told that his anger was a natural response to social injustice, assured that society's standards didn't apply to him because of his disadvantaged background. The cruel irony was breathtaking. Elite educators, living in communities where such permissiveness would be unthinkable, had imposed their experimental philosophies on working-class children who desperately needed structure and discipline. They had taken children like Jason and systematically destroyed their chances of success while congratulating themselves on their progressive values. These children became the subjects of a vast social experiment, conducted by people who would never dream of subjecting their own offspring to such treatment. The cultural degradation wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of policies crafted by elites who confused compassion with permissiveness. They had eliminated consequences for destructive behavior while maintaining them in their own lives. They preached tolerance for cultural practices they would never accept in their own neighborhoods. They celebrated diversity in schools their own children would never attend. Most perniciously, they had convinced themselves that this represented moral progress rather than systematic abandonment of the vulnerable to chaos and dysfunction. This cultural vandalism, dressed as compassion, created generations of young people unprepared for adult life, unable to delay gratification, incapable of sustained effort, yet convinced of their entitlement to success without achievement. Chapter 3: Question your assumptions about helping. I invite you to examine your own assumptions about what constitutes genuine help. Consider this: every successful civilization has recognized that true assistance requires demanding standards and expects improvement from those receiving aid. Yet our current system does precisely the opposite, asking nothing while providing everything, then expressing surprise when recipients become increasingly helpless. The evidence contradicts every progressive assumption about human nature. In my experience, people flourish when challenged and deteriorate when coddled. The homeless man who's given unconditional housing often becomes more, not less, dysfunctional. The student promoted without mastering basic skills develops not confidence but shame disguised as defiance. The welfare recipient assured that her circumstances result from social injustice rather than personal choices becomes increasingly passive and resentful. Historical comparison illuminates the true causes versus supposed causes of social pathology. Previous generations of immigrants arrived with nothing yet achieved remarkable prosperity through discipline and delayed gratification. They succeeded not because society was more compassionate, but because it demanded more of them. They were expected to learn the language, adopt local customs, and contribute to their communities. Modern compassion has eliminated these expectations, replacing them with endless excuses for failure and permanent victimhood status. The psychological damage of this approach is profound. When we tell people they cannot succeed because of their circumstances, we rob them of agency. When we lower standards to accommodate dysfunction, we communicate that we don't believe they're capable of meeting higher ones. When we blame society for individual failures, we train people to see themselves as powerless victims rather than autonomous agents capable of improvement. The most devastating aspect is how this false compassion creates the very problems it claims to address. By removing consequences for destructive behavior, we ensure its continuation. By providing benefits without requiring responsibility, we subsidize irresponsibility. By treating people as victims rather than agents, we manufacture the helplessness we then claim to combat. The result is a self-perpetuating system that requires continued dysfunction to justify its existence, ensuring that those it claims to help remain trapped in cycles of dependency and despair. Chapter 4: When Sentimentalism Becomes Systematic Suffering. The most chilling aspect of liberal elite compassion is how it transforms individual tragedy into systematic policy, ensuring that isolated problems become widespread pathologies. In my psychiatric practice, I observed how sentimentalism, emotion divorced from reason and consequence, created suffering on an industrial scale. Consider the policy of deinstitutionalization, championed by compassionate reformers who were horrified by the conditions in mental hospitals. Their solution was to close these facilities and integrate patients into the community, a policy that sounded humane in university lecture halls but proved catastrophic in practice. The architects of this reform lived in communities where they would never encounter its consequences. They had private healthcare, gated neighborhoods, and children in schools far from the chaos they had unleashed. Meanwhile, seriously mentally ill individuals were abandoned to homelessness, addiction, and crime. The compassionate reformers had eliminated the admittedly imperfect system that at least provided shelter and medication, replacing it with nothing but slogans about dignity and choice. The result? Thousands of vulnerable people condemned to lives of degradation that would have been unimaginable in the institutions these reformers had closed. This pattern repeats across every area where elite compassion operates. Family courts that prioritize parents' rights over children's welfare, creating generations of traumatized children. Educational policies that eliminate academic standards to avoid hurting feelings, condemning poor children to lives of economic marginalization. Criminal justice reforms that prioritize criminals' rehabilitation over victims' safety, ensuring that violence becomes a viable life strategy. The psychology of those who defend these policies reveals the true nature of sentimental compassion. When confronted with evidence of their policies' failures, they invariably respond not with practical adjustments but with moral superiority. They claim that criticism stems from lack of compassion rather than concern for outcomes. They redefine success to exclude actual improvement in people's lives, focusing instead on process and intention. Most perniciously, they position themselves as the sole guardians of moral virtue, treating any practical objection as evidence of heartlessness. This allows them to maintain their self-image as compassionate while ignoring the suffering their policies create. Sentimentalism becomes a moral luxury that the privileged purchase with other people's misery, a way of feeling virtuous without bearing any cost for being wrong. Chapter 5. Observe the language games of power. I encourage you to observe how the corruption of language serves to obscure the realities I've described. The liberal elite have developed an entire vocabulary designed to prevent honest discussion of their policies' failures. This linguistic manipulation isn't accidental, it's essential for maintaining systems that benefit the powerful while harming those they claim to serve. Notice how homelessness has replaced vagrancy, transforming a behavioral choice into a passive condition that happens to people rather than something they do. Substance abuse has replaced drug addiction, making destructive behavior sound like a medical condition rather than a moral failing. Alternative lifestyles has replaced dysfunctional behavior, elevating chaos to the status of legitimate choice. Each linguistic substitution serves to remove agency and responsibility from individuals while expanding the power of professional helpers. The euphemistic language serves multiple functions. First, it prevents accurate diagnosis by obscuring the true nature of problems. You cannot solve drug addiction if you refuse to acknowledge that it involves moral as well as medical components. You cannot address family breakdown if you're forbidden to discuss the importance of stable relationships and personal responsibility. Second, it creates a professional class whose expertise depends on maintaining these linguistic distinctions, ensuring that solutions remain forever just out of reach. Higher education has become the primary factory for this corrupted language. Students are taught to speak in euphemisms that make clear thinking impossible. They learn to discuss poverty without mentioning personal responsibility, crime without discussing moral agency, family breakdown without acknowledging the importance of marriage and commitment. This isn't education, it's indoctrination into a worldview that serves elite interests while harming those it claims to champion. The linguistic corruption extends to policy documents, academic research, and media coverage. Problems are always described in ways that expand government programs and professional intervention while eliminating any possibility of simple, practical solutions. The language itself becomes a barrier to improvement, ensuring that those who suffer remain trapped in systems that profit from their dysfunction. Most insidiously, this linguistic manipulation trains people to think in ways that make them powerless to improve their circumstances, teaching them to see themselves as victims of forces beyond their control rather than agents capable of change. Chapter 6: The Intolerant Tolerance of Moral Relativism. The moral relativism championed by liberal elites reveals itself as profoundly intolerant when examined through the lens of clinical practice. In treating patients from various cultural backgrounds, I discovered that relativism serves not to promote genuine tolerance but to impose elite values while destroying the moral frameworks that provide meaning and structure to ordinary people's lives. Consider the case of Amira, a young Muslim woman caught between her family's traditional expectations and the relativistic values promoted by her university professors. These educators, claiming to respect her cultural background, simultaneously undermined every aspect of her heritage that didn't conform to progressive orthodoxy. They celebrated her hijab as cultural expression while condemning her family's emphasis on modesty and marriage. They praised diversity while attacking the religious beliefs that gave her life meaning. The professors' relativism extended only to superficial cultural markers, not to substantive moral differences. They could tolerate different foods, clothes, and languages, but not different views on personal responsibility, sexual morality, or family structure. Their tolerance was conditional on conformity to progressive values, making it a form of cultural imperialism disguised as respect for diversity. This selective relativism creates profound psychological distress in young people who need coherent moral frameworks to develop healthy identities. When told that all values are equally valid, they lose the capacity to make meaningful choices. When assured that traditional moral standards are oppressive, they're left without guidance for navigating complex moral decisions. The result is anxiety, depression, and behavior that would have been recognized as obviously destructive in more morally coherent societies. The elite advocates of relativism never apply their principles to their own lives. They maintain strict standards for their children's education, behavior, and associations while insisting that such standards are oppressive when applied to others. They live in communities with clear behavioral expectations while advocating for the elimination of such expectations elsewhere. They practice a functional morality in their private lives while preaching dysfunctional relativism in their public roles. Most destructively, their relativism becomes a new form of tyranny, more absolute than traditional moral systems because it cannot be questioned or challenged. Anyone who suggests that some values might be objectively better than others is dismissed as bigoted or intolerant. This creates a system where the most destructive behaviors must be celebrated as equally valid choices, ensuring continued suffering among those least equipped to recover from poor decisions. Chapter 7: The Practical Program for Individual Resistance. Based on 30 years of clinical observation, I can offer practical prescriptions for resisting the systematic destruction wrought by elite compassion. The treatment begins with recognizing that genuine helping requires demanding high standards and expecting improvement from those receiving assistance. First, restore the connection between choice and consequence in your own life and communities. Every successful patient I've treated began recovery by accepting responsibility for their circumstances, regardless of contributing factors beyond their control. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine disadvantages, but recognizing that improvement requires personal agency rather than external intervention. Encourage this recognition in others by refusing to accept excuses for destructive behavior while offering genuine support for positive changes. Second, defend objective standards against relativistic assault. Children, patients, and community members need clear expectations and consistent consequences. The chaos that results from abandoned standards isn't liberation, it's abandonment. Maintain high expectations for behavior, achievement, and moral conduct, understanding that people rise to meet standards when they're clearly communicated and consistently enforced. Third, resist linguistic manipulation by insisting on precise language that acknowledges moral agency. Refuse to adopt euphemisms that obscure personal responsibility or transform destructive choices into passive conditions. Call drug addiction what it is, not substance abuse. Describe family breakdown honestly, not as alternative family structures. Use language that empowers people to change rather than trapping them in victimhood narratives. Fourth, support traditional institutions that provide meaning and structure, stable families, religious communities, voluntary associations, and educational institutions that prioritize knowledge over ideology. These institutions developed over centuries because they work, not because they're oppressive. They provide the moral framework necessary for human flourishing, offering both support and accountability. Fifth, recognize that genuine charity requires discrimination, the ability to distinguish between deserving and undeserving cases, between temporary assistance and permanent dependency, between help that empowers and help that enslaves. True compassion sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. Finally, understand that cultural renewal begins with individual reform. Model the behavior and values you want to see in society. Demonstrate that traditional virtues aren't oppressive but liberating, providing the foundation for meaningful achievement and genuine happiness. Conclusion. The shocking truth about liberal elite compassion is that it represents the opposite of genuine care for human welfare. It's a system designed to maintain the moral superiority of the privileged while ensuring the continued dysfunction of those it claims to serve. This isn't accidental, it's the inevitable result of policies crafted by people who will never bear their costs. True compassion demands courage to tell uncomfortable truths, impose necessary standards, and expect improvement from those receiving help. It requires recognizing that human beings need challenge and responsibility to flourish, not endless excuses and permanent victim status. The liberal elite's version of compassion denies human dignity by treating people as incapable of moral agency and personal growth. The evidence from 3 decades of clinical practice is overwhelming. Societies flourish when they maintain high standards and clear expectations, while they decay when they embrace relativism and abandon accountability. The choice before us is stark: continue enabling the systematic cruelty disguised as compassion, or restore the demanding love that genuinely serves human flourishing. Those who profit from the current system will resist this restoration with all their power, claiming that standards are oppressive and expectations are cruel. But for those trapped by false compassion, genuine reform offers the only path to dignity, achievement, and meaningful life. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it remains our most powerful tool for combating the systematic destruction of human potential that masquerades as virtue in our degraded culture.